Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 worst Journey to Unguro cards in Arena. Starting off with the number 10 spot, it's Warrior's Cornered Sentry. Although this one might not look that bad at a raw stat level. You play a 2/6, you give your opponent basically a 3/3. If they trade back in, you're kind of left with a 2/3 minion for 2 mana, which feels merely average in Arena. But of course the problem is you're giving your opponent those raptors and they get to dictate what they do with them. They might play a Direwolf Alpha and trade super efficiently into you. They might just remove your minion and then have 3 minions left. Giving them those stats is a super high risk because they get to act on them first. And since you're very unlikely to have some sort of super combo Cornered Sentry into Whirlwind effect in Arena, and Warrior is just so typically bad in Arena anyway, it's very difficult to ever actually make this card a success. And most of the time it's a super high risk that is very low in the reward category even when it works. Up next at the number 9 spot is the Primal Fin Look Out. The problem here, of course, is that this card is super conditional. You have to have a Murloc on the board, and then even when you do, you're really only getting a card draw effect. You're not getting a tempo or board presence kind of play, so you're really sacrificing a pretty important turn with turn 3 as far as a stat allocation is concerned, simply because this is really more like a 2 mana minion for stats. So it's a slower play that rewards you long term, and then even when it does reward you, of course, Murlocs just aren't that strong on average. And the biggest problem is still that condition has to be met, and it's not that easy to draft a consistent Murloc deck, and then it's not that easy to have all your Murlocs in hand at the right time, and it's not that easy to stick a Murloc on the board so you can activate the Primal Fin Look Out. So basically 99% of the time you end up with a Bloodfin Raptor for 3 mana, and of course that's an absolutely terrible card to have in Arena. Up next at the number 8 spot is the Primal Fin Champion, another Primal Fin Murloc that is far too conditional to actually succeed all that often in Arena. The biggest problem here, of course, is just lining up all the cards to make this thing actually valuable. Of course, buffs in Arena are really good for Paladin on average, but you don't always have them in hand when you need to. You can't always play them when you need to. And in the meantime, for the rest of the game, you're sacrificing a bunch of stats on a 2-drop just to play a card that has some potential upside that's very difficult to actually achieve. So in many cases, you'd just be better off with a 2 mana 2/3 that you could buff and have those extra couple stats immediately, giving yourself essentially some cards back, or usually at most 1 card back, isn't really worth it necessarily to give up an extra little piece of value on the board immediately from just a standard 2-drop or other 2-drops, of course, with more upside. So this is another card where the condition's just a little bit too difficult to make everything line up nicely, and the risk is much higher than the reward. Moving on to the number 7 spot, it's the Devilsaur Egg. And yet again, here we have a card that's just too hard to actually make it work. The problem here, of course, is that most of the time you'll play this out there committing 3 mana, which is actually quite a bit for a minion that doesn't do anything, and your opponent will just be able to ignore it, and you'll never actually draw another condition to activate this card. Now, of course, if you do activate it, it can be pretty good. A 5/5 for 3 mana is a fairly strong play. The problem is, it's hard to draft cards to activate this most of the time, and then it's hard to draw those cards at the point when you actually need them to make Devilsaur Egg active. So most of the time it'll just be sitting there for 3, 4, 5 turns before it ever does anything, and sacrificing that much tempo just gives your opponent the win before you're ever able to make this card work. Up next at the number 6 spot is Warrior's Explore Unguro. The biggest problem here with Explore Unguro is that it's basically just a redraft of your deck, but there's a lot more Warrior cards than usual when you redraft with Explore Unguro, and Warrior cards on average just aren't very good in Arena. You're often better off with neutral cards than you are Warrior cards, because Warrior has so many very situational cards that fail in Arena. So it usually gives you a new redraft that's even worse than the draft that you started with, not to mention it costs some mana to actually do that along the way, and it really limits your choices and kills any good cards you actually did draft and had in your deck. So another card where the payoff is actually almost negative, it's not beneficial at all, and there's just a lot of risk in running this too. So unfortunately, yet another Warrior card that just doesn't work in Arena, partly though because Warrior just doesn't work all that well in Arena. Moving on to the number 5 spot, it's Rogue's Razor Petal Volley. The real problem here is that this card in total basically costs 4 mana, and at best you get 2 pings. You get a 1 damage ping and another 1 damage ping. It's just very slow. It's barely a hero power in efficiency, and of course hero powers are pretty darn slow in Arena, especially for Rogue, who already has access to a really good ping in its weapon. So this card ends up being too slow, and it just doesn't pack enough punch compared to other things you could get for 4 mana. This doesn't do nearly enough, and there's not any ways to really combo this or utilize it in extra special ways like a constructed Rogue might be able to do, for instance, with Gadgets and Auctioneer. So ultimately, you're just left with a card that doesn't really do anything when you could have had a card that does something really significant in its place. Now it's time for the number 4 card, and it's Shaman's Fire, Plume, Harbinger. This is another one of those cards that has a really specific effect or condition to make it a valuable card, and it's just too hard to draft into that condition in Arena. Specifically this time, this one reduces the cost of elementals in your hand by 1. And the big problem, of course, is that you're just not going to end up with that many elementals in your draft. Even if you go all in on elementals and you draft like 10 or 12 elementals, there's not necessarily going to be that many in your hand. And you're sacrificing a lot of stats on a pivotal turn 2 to basically accomplish a little bit of a gain later on, but you're going to let your opponent get ahead and start to build steam and start to roll over you. And once you're playing from behind in Arena, it can be very difficult to catch up, even with these tempo cost reductions that Fire, Plume, Harbinger can provide. But that's still in an ideal setting. If it works out perfectly, it might be okay, and 99% of the time it's going to work out terribly, and it's just going to put you too far behind to ever actually recover. And now it's time for the top 3, starting off with the Emerald Hive Queen. This card just has an incredibly punishing effect, and frankly, it's not strong enough to make up for it. Making your minions cost 2 more on turn 1 puts you behind for the entire course of the game, because your opponent doesn't necessarily have to kill this card, and there's just not enough stats here to make up for that sacrifice. So often this is going to punish you way more than it ever pays off. Plus, you're actually giving your opponent the ability to dictate that to some extent, right? They can play around this, play multiple smaller minions so that this thing can't actually kill itself, get ahead on the board. You're going to be left with nothing to do and no plays to make. Plus, this card is okay maybe on turn 1 because it can trade into some 2-drops and stuff. But as you top deck this in the late game in Arena, it can be absolutely devastating, because if you do have to play it, every turn thereon is basically ruined because everything costs 2 extra mana. So not a lot of upside in this card, and a ton of downside makes it virtually unplayable. And now for the number 2 card, it's another warrior card. This time it's Ironhide. This thing really has a couple problems. At the end of the day, health gain just isn't that important in Arena. Having value on the board, being able to dictate and control the board is way more vital to success. So this is just a 5 health gain that accomplishes virtually nothing in a vast majority of Arena games. Not to mention, it's a 1 mana card, it's a spell. It just doesn't pack enough punch. There's not enough here. You're giving up a draw and a slot in your deck for a card that doesn't actively impact the board, and virtually anything else is going to be a better draft that gives you better results than Ironhide. There are lots of other things that heal you and give you armor that could accomplish the same thing, but while also developing a minion or responding to your opponent's board, meaning this thing just doesn't actually do anything at all, making it one of the worst cards in Arena. And then finally, the worst Unguro card in Arena. That honor belongs to the humongous Razor Leaf. Another card that literally can't do anything. This is one that you throw out there and it just can't attack. And much like some of the other cards on this list, there's often just no actual way to activate this thing. Sure, you could draft a Sunfury Protector or a Defender of Argus. Maybe you could draft some sort of silence effect to make this thing work. But that's such a rare occasion, and it almost never lines up properly in terms of mana or which cards you draw, that you're never going to see this thing actually do anything important. And the rest of the time, you're just committing 3 mana to a card with very little upside. When you compare this to other things, Humongous Razor Leaf by comparison is just unfathomably awful. It just sits there and basically taunts you that you wasted 3 mana, you wasted a card in your draft, and it's not going to accomplish anything. It is the humongous Razor Leaf, and it is a humongous disappointment in Arena. And there you have it. That's my list. Now, I have to say that Journey to Ungoro had some really good Arena cards, and frankly, the bad ones here aren't as bad as some bad ones in previous expansions or sets. Clearly, they're still pretty bad, and you should almost never draft them unless your choices are just abysmal. But at the end of the day, Ungoro was a successful expansion as far as Arena is concerned, and has really reshaped the Arena meta quite a bit. Just be sure that you do avoid these cards most of the time, and you'll find a little bit more success in Arena. But I'm curious what you guys have to say about this list. Which cards do you think I got right? Which cards did I get wrong? How would you shuffle it? Did I leave any cards out that you found incredibly unsuccessful in Arena thus far? I'm curious to hear all of those thoughts. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.